The hearth roared with warmth. Above it hung a large boar's head, a relic from a hunt long past. Its tusks gleaming in the flickering firelight, casting dancing shadows on the wood walls, while the scent of roasted meat and musty ale filled the air. Villagers crowded the tables, their faces flushed with laughter and the sharp tang of hoppy beer, while mugs clinked and the low hum of chatter wrapped itself around the room like an old familiar blanket. Hellusina moved through the crowd with an agile grace, balancing mugs on a tray as she wove between the tables. She greeted patrons with brief nods and a practiced smile. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. Not the spilled beer she wiped up with a flick of a cloth, nor the hushed exchanges of gossip between villagers. She was the queen of the Prancing Boar, and queens, even tired ones, keep their kingdoms clean. She had come from the Southlands 9 years ago, around the time Boar town had raised its first church steeple. It wasn't a town at that point. Not truly. Not yet. Just a sprawl of ambition clinging to the earth. There hadn't been much need for a tavern then, or much to drink about, save hope and determination. Settling here hadn't been her plan, but plans were fragile things, and life had a habit of trading them in for what it thought you needed instead. She'd found shelter her first night in a forester's home, a young family, kind and plain-spoken. What was meant to be a day's rest became a week. She paid her stay with quiet work, scrubbing pots, helping with laundry, chopping, kindling. It was honest labour, and it kept her from remembering how far from home she really was. No doubt she would have moved on, but something caught her eye. You see, the Foresters had a son, a layabout, truth be told, idle, directionless, and 2 years older than Hellusina. But some twist of fate, or vanity, roused him from his sullen state. He began fetching water, fixing hinges, laughing in the yard, as if he had always been that way. She knew it for what it was, even then, but still, it charmed her. Hellusina had set out to find destiny, and destiny, mischievous thing that it is, had rewarded her with Gresmir. Behind the bar, with a warm grin that seemed to be permanently etched onto his face, her husband, with a relaxed confidence, worked cheerfully, wiping down the counter between pouring mugs of beer, his mood as light as the atmosphere around him, his eyes sparkling with an amiable mischief that made even the briefest exchanges feel like a shared secret. As racks of dried herbs and garlic hung from the beams, a cluster of old men tucked away in a corner smoked long pipes with the solemn intensity of priests, while Hellusina weaved deftly between them all, much like the markings carved into the timber of the tavern itself, initials of sweethearts and faded tally marks of debts long forgotten. The night was progressing as you would expect, to the sound of the clink of mugs, the chatter of the villagers, the crack of the logs on the hearth, and the occasional laughter from the cutters as they share their worries with one another. That is, until the tavern door swung open, admitting the blacksmith, whose tall figure loomed briefly in the entrance, with him a trader from Northbury, his cloak, dusty from the road, pulled tight around him, almost obscuring his face. Gresmir eyed them as they made their way to a shadowed table near the back and sat down. Hellusina already weaving between the tables towards them, tray in hand, as they began a low conversation. "Ozymandias, usual, is it?" The blacksmith had barely settled into his stool before the question came like an arrow shot from an expert bow. Except it wasn't a bowman, it was the crystal-clear gaze of the barmaid. Ozymandias wiped his running nose on the cuff of his sleeve and nodded to her. "What is it for your friend?" she replied. The man opposite was ill at ease, lowering himself awkwardly onto his stool, as if there were some unseen splinters causing him pain in his posterior. Truth be it, these stools were worn smoother than the oxen leather of a ploughman. "Nothing," he spoke. "Come now, you can't come into a tavern this late and cold a night without a need for something to warm you. It wouldn't be polite to have a guest so inhospitable." She shrugged a hip in his direction. The man looked to Ozymandias for guidance, but none came. "I'll have what he's having then." "Another big drinker, eh?" Hellusina gave Ozzy a wink, turned on her heel, and left the two in their secluded corner. Low chatter filled the tavern atmosphere like the scent of sweet ale. Light bounced off the earthen walls and fell onto the dusty floor. Wooden stools creaked under the occasional chuckle of the foresters sharing stories, and the boar's head looked down on them with a helpless look in its eye. Hellusina made her way back to the bar to find Gresmir gazing into the abyss of his own navel, which, given the dim lighting and general state of distraction that cloaked him most days, took more commitment than she cared to understand. She waited. He didn't blink. She cleared her throat, but nothing. The silence was slow and stubborn, like mould in the corners of an untended room. She let out a breath through her nose, steady and long. Not angry, not exactly, just tired of that old way that comes from repeating the same scene too many times to count. With an exasperated groan, well used and well earned over the years, she stepped behind the bar. Her hands knew the rhythm of the place, even when her heart felt distant from it. She poured 2 mugs of warm milk, steam curling from the surface like faint, ghostly ribbons, and placed them on her tray, with the precision that came not from pride, but from habit, the kind of discipline that grows in the shadow of long compromise. "I would have got them," Gresmir said suddenly, voice slow and soft like something waking from a dream. She didn't look at him. "Well, it's too late now. Get your head out of the clouds." There was no venom in it, just the weary tone of a woman who had said too many versions of the same thing. She moved back across the floor, weaving between the benches and stools, her hips brushing the sides of the tables as she passed. The tavern smelled of sweet wood smoke and roasted grain. She reached the blacksmith and her companion. Offering the mugs with a practised smile, they thanked her, eyes grateful, and she nodded in return, polite, cordial, warm in the way bark is warm after sunlight. Behind the bar, Gresmir scratched idly at his chest, still half lost in whatever thoughts had taken him. Thoughts, she suspected, that led nowhere in particular. They had built this place together, brick by brick, beam by beam, and yet, some nights, it felt as though she were the only one still holding it up. The tavern door creaked open again, and this time Battestina entered, her hair flickering to and fro as she scanned the room, clearly looking for someone. Her dress, laced firmly, hugged her at the waist, the simple fabric accentuating the sway of her hips as she moved through the tavern towards her father, who was deep in conversation with a group of fellow woodcutters at the end of the bar. But as she approached, she locked eyes with Gresmir and wheeled towards him instead. A patron called out from a nearby table, pulling Hellusina's attention as she caught sight of Battestina. Something about the way the younger woman moved, her confidence, her figure, made Hellusina's eyes narrow slightly. She took the patron's order, but kept an eye on the bar as she worked, her gaze flicking back to her husband and Battestina as they exchanged words. "Evening, Battestina," Gresmir called out, his voice rising over the din. "Looking for something or someone?" Battestina's lips curved into a playful smile. "Just here for my father," she replied, leaning up against the bar. but I couldn't help noticing how lively it is tonight. You look like you're having fun." Gresmir chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Always am, especially when I get company like yours." She raised an eyebrow. Her posture relaxed as she leaned further into the counter, the light fabric of her dress following the curve of her back. "You're always full of charm, Gresmir. Makes me wonder if you ever get tired of it." "Never," he said with a wink, wiping down the bar in front of her. "It's what keeps this place running." From across the room, Hellusina's eyes narrowed further as she watched the exchange, though her expression remained mostly neutral. A small, sharp frown had worked its way into her gaze. She found herself moving towards the pair, suddenly less interested in the chattering patrons around her. The room seemed to grow smaller as she watched the two exchange words across the bar. "It's nothing," she thought, turning back to the farmer she'd been talking to. His face was as rutted as a ploughed field, she thought. She nodded and smiled as he told her about Lord Barra's plans to relocate them to a new farm across the river. He was so proud that he'd been given even more land. Now he just needed to convince his wife they needed more children, because he'd need the extra hands, of course. He stopped talking abruptly and looked down at his drink sheepishly. Hellusina took a look over her shoulder to find Gresmir, his mouth wide in laughter, and Battestina leaning even further over the counter. Battestina was enjoying herself when she caught sight of Hellusina arriving at her side, her smile softening but never fading. "Hellusina!" She greeted her with a polite nod. "Your husband was just keeping me entertained while I waited for my father." I'm sure he was." Hellusina sat a rag down on the bar. She turned to Gresmir, who was still smiling, though there was a small bead of sweat forming at his temple. He began to run his cloth slowly over the bar in front of him. Hellusina reached out and placed a hand on top to stop him. "Ah, bless him," before addressing Battestina again. "He's good at that." As if on cue, Battestina's father waved her over, a set of keys dangling from his hand. "Battestina! Here, girl, get what you came for!" With a graceful turn, Battestina straightened up, casting one last glance at Gresmir. "I'll leave you to it then. Thanks for the chat, Gresmir." "Any time," he said, his grin never faltering as he watched her walk away, her skirts swaying lightly as she made her way to her father. Battestina reached the group of woodcutters in quiet chit-chat. She made to collect the ring of keys, but her father's calloused hand clamped down over them first. His knuckles were scraped raw, stained with bark and pitch, and his eyes narrowed beneath heavy brows darkened with sweat and smoke. "You're late," he grunted, loud enough to cut through the men's chatter, but not so loud as to draw more than a glance. The words landed heavier than they needed to, made of worry, not wrath, though he'd never admit it. "I know," Battestina replied, avoiding his gaze. "I helped with the stacking. I came straight after." He shoved the keys towards her, the iron cold even in the warmth of the tavern. "Take the long way around. Wolves have been spotted again, and keep your hood up, cold enough to crack stone." Battestina gave a small nod, muttered a quiet "Yes, Papa," and stepped away from the table. Her father watched her go, his hand curling once around the tankard. She threaded her way past the hearth, and one of the butcher's brothers, who was passed out, his hand wrapped around his tankard, towards the heavy oaked door. She was trying not to look at Hellusina, who was watching her every move. The tavern's warmth wrapped around her like a farewell embrace, the scent of pine smoke, spilled cider, damp wool, and sweat. At the door, she hesitated, pulling her hood over her head with one hand while the other tightened around the keys, and with a creak, she eased it open. The cold rushed in, stealing warmth from her cheeks and coiling down her back. Snow threatened in the air. She could taste it, sharp and bitter on the breeze. As she stepped across the threshold, the firelight spilled after her, throwing her silhouette long and slender against the drifting night. For one suspended moment, she stood there, caught between the glow of the tavern and the hush of the woods beyond, her figure outlined like a sketch on the tavern wall. Then the door swung shut behind her with a thud, snuffing out the light, and Batistina vanished into the cold. Hellusina lingered by the bar for a moment longer, her gaze fixed, though she pretended otherwise, on the blacksmith seated alone at the far table, nursing his drink with the deliberate slowness of a man who didn't want to go home just yet. His broad shoulders hunched slightly, the flicker of the fire catching in the dull sheen of soot still clinging to his sleeves. His companion had disappeared, their business seemingly concluded. Her husband, for his part, was also seemingly oblivious, laughing too easily, lingering too long at the young maid's rear, polishing the same mug with theatrical flourish as if it might catch more than dust. Hellusina gave a soft, almost fond tut, the kind shaped more by memory than reproach. "You used to look at me like that." Gresmir shrugged in the way he always had, non-committal, sheepish. He held her gaze and leaned in to kiss her cheek. But as his lips brushed her skin, she tried not to smile, as it brought a memory of a younger Gresmir with a smirk on his face, pleased over a compliment he'd made her as he handed her a crooked spoon he'd carved in secret. He looked at her then like she had been the first sun after winter. She liked that look, now swallowed by years. And yet, always when the tankards were full and the backs were turned, her eyes would flicker back to Gresmir, a glance, never long, in search, perhaps, not for who he was, but for who he had been, and the version of herself who once met him there. Outside, the village of Bara had settled into a hush that followed a long day. Darkness stretched across the streets like a wool blanket, soft and heavy, broken only by the pale shimmer of moonlight on frost-slicked eaves and the occasional lantern left burning in a window. The Prancing Boar stood at the heart of Bara town, like a stubborn hearthstone, unmoving, warm, and weathered by the years. Its timber frame creaked with life, not age, and lantern light spilled from its windows in golden ribbons, inviting the cold and weary to step inside. It was just a building, nothing more, stone, wood, and sweat-built beams, but it was cared for as if it were a child. Every nail driven, every mug polished, every floorboard swept bore the signature of devotion. It was a place built not simply to stand, but to hold the noise and laughter, the tears, the spilled drink, the secrets told too loud of a stew and song. Inside, the tavern breathed with the rhythm of the patrons. Tankards thudded against tables, laughter chased insults in good fun, boots scraped the earth, dice rattled, a lute sang faintly in the corner, and through it all moved Hellusina, her presence more constant than the walls. The fire in the hearth wasn't roaring, but steady, tended not for show, but for comfort. Its heat crept into joints and stories alike. A pair of hunters argued over the weight of a boar, while a shepherd quietly carved a bit of bone into a token, unaware of the flower on his sleeves. Behind the bar, Gresmir leaned half-interested on the counter, polishing a mug with the slow care of someone who knew the task was less about cleaning and more about continuing. The way he touched the tavern was the way one might pat a son's back, distracted, loving, uncertain of the words to say. Yes, the Prancing Boar was only wood and stone, but in the hands of its keepers it had been raised into something far more difficult to name, a place where lives were quietly stitched together, night after night, drink after drink. In the hills beyond the town, the trader from Northbury was gone, his cart tracks already crusting over with a thin layer of frost. Only a scrap of burlap left snagged on a post gave any sign he'd been there at all. The square that had buzzed with haggling and horse hooves earlier that day, now sat quiet as a chapel. Shutters were drawn, doors bolted, smoke drifted lazily from crooked chimneys, thinning as it rose into the star-salted sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and fell silent. The village breathed in sleep, its corners softened by moonlight, its secrets tucked beneath roofs and rafters. And yet, the prancing boar, its windows still aglow, misted with the breaths of the late drinkers, lingered, their voices lower now, stories slower, more honest. The fire whispered low lullabies of ash and ember. Hellusina wiped down the bar with the same care she always had, though no one watched her now. Gresmir, collecting a lone mug, just the rhythm of something familiar, something shared. They moved around each other in the small space, neither colliding nor speaking, the kind of silence that only exists between people who had known each other long, too long to pretend. She caught his eye at one point, just a flicker, no accusation, no apology, just tired affection and the hint of a smile pressed between them like a well-earned coin. The tavern would sleep soon, but not yet. Like a child unwilling to be tucked away, it clung to the last waking moments, content in the care of those who'd raised it. A few more mugs to wash, a log to turn, a candle to snuff. Outside, the village dreamed, but inside the boar, the night lingered, held gently in hands that had built it, fed it, loved it, and kept it warm. Thank you for listening. This has been the Loom of Tales.